In the autumn of 1882, while other settlers stored grain and sealed their cabins, Mary Tanner was driven out with one pregnant cow. She made her way to a narrow rock overhang on the northern ridge. With her dog as her only company, she stacked a dry stone wall across the opening, sealing herself against the coming blizzards. Those who exiled her gave her no chance. They didn't know what that cow would birth, or what the cliff face had been storing all summer. Mary Tanner was barely 29, a woman with calloused hands and a mind that read cattle better than most men read scripture. She had no husband anymore, no claim, no legal right to the land she had worked for 8 years. The morning they sent her away, the law allowed her exactly one pregnant cow and the clothes on her back. She did not beg. She walked north into broken country where the land buckled into limestone cliffs, and she found an overhang deep enough to keep off the hardest weather. No one in that valley believed she would last a month, but Mary looked at the south-facing rock, felt the heat still radiating from its surface long after the sun had dropped, and understood something the farmers below had never noticed. That cliff wasn't just shelter. It was a solar engine. What she built inside that stone crevice over one brutal winter would not only keep her alive, but would create a herd where there had been only exile. And the very people who cast her out would one day have to buy back the land they stole. The morning they sent her away, the valley stretched pale and frozen under a sky the color of hammered tin. Caleb Harker stood on the porch of what had been her house and watched her leave with the same flat expression he wore when he hired men or sold off-cull cattle. He was her dead husband's brother, and he had found a judge in Laramie who agreed that a woman with no living male relative on the deed had no claim worth honoring. Mary was handed exactly one pregnant heifer and a piece of paper she could not read that declared the rest forfeit. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned the cow's lead rope toward the northern ridge and began walking, her dog Belle following close behind with its tail tucked low against a rising wind. The heifer's name was Briar. She was a dun-colored shorthorn cross with one broken horn and a belly already swelling from a bull Mary's husband had traded for before he died. Briar was slow, steady, and worth almost nothing on the open market that season because she was due to calve in the worst possible month, February, when the plains still belonged to the snow. For 2 days Mary walked north into broken ground where the prairie gave way to limestone escarpments that jutted from the earth like the exposed ribs of a dead beast. Most settlers avoided this country. The soil was too thin for planting, the water too scarce in summer, and the cliffs attracted wolves. But Mary remembered something her husband once told her during a spring cattle drive when they had camped beneath one of those overhangs to escape a sudden hailstorm. He had pressed his hand flat against the stone long after sunset and told her the rock still held the afternoon heat like a warm skillet. That memory did not fade. As she stood beneath a wide overhang on the third afternoon, she placed her own palm against the pale limestone and felt the same slow heat bleeding into her frozen fingers. The cliff face faced south, catching every hour of winter sun the sky could offer. And the overhang cut deep enough that a person could stand upright 15 feet inside without touching the back wall. Mary decided right then that this would be her home. She did not know it yet, but that decision would rewrite everything that came after. The first week was nothing but labor stripped to its brutal essentials. Mary used fallen slabs of limestone and smaller scree to build a dry stone wall across the mouth of the overhang, packing each gap with clay dug from a frozen seep nearby. She had no mortar, no timber for a frame, no experienced hands to guide her. What she had was a memory of building goat pens as a girl in Ohio, and a back strong enough to haul 100-pound stones uphill until her shoulders screamed. The wall rose slowly, uneven but thick, nearly 3 feet at its base and tapering inward as it climbed toward the overhang's lip. She left a single narrow opening on the eastern side for a doorway, then hung her only wool blanket across it to keep the wind from knifing inside. Behind the wall, the space felt smaller than before but safer. The rock above blocked the rain and snow. The wall blocked the constant wind. And the stone around her, lit by a small fire built near the entrance, began to absorb warmth during the day and release it at night, just as her husband had described. The first time she woke in the darkness and felt the air several degrees warmer than the frozen world outside, something hard and cautious loosened in her chest. Briar stood at the far end of the shelter on a bed of dried grass Mary had cut from a sheltered hollow below the escarpment. The dog Belle slept pressed against her belly. There was barely enough room for all three of them, and at night the smell of cattle and wet wool filled the space until Mary's throat ached. But it was shelter, and shelter was survival. On the fifth evening, a trapper heading south spotted smoke curling from the cliff face and rode up to investigate. His name was Silas Drover, a weathered man in greasy buckskins who trapped the upper streams for beaver when the price made it worth the frostbite. He stared at the stone wall for a long moment without speaking, his mule stamping impatiently behind him. Then he looked at Mary, then at the cow, then back at the wall. "You're the widow Harker threw off his place," he said. It was not a question. Mary did not answer. She stood in the entrance with Belle growling low beside her, and she waited. Silas spat into the snow. "That cow drops her calf out here, you'll lose them both. Cliff won't stop a real freeze. The cold rises through the stone floor, gets into the udder, and the milk sours before the calf can stand. I seen it." He told her she would be better off walking back to the settlement and begging Caleb for mercy, that a woman alone in winter country was a corpse waiting to happen. Mary listened without expression. Then she asked him how the beaver pelts were selling this season. Silas stared at her as if she had spoken in another language. He shook his head, muttered something about fools and frozen graves, and rode on. That night, Mary added more stones to the wall and piled loose dirt against the base where the floor met the stone to seal any draft. She had noticed already what the trapper had missed. The overhang's floor was not bare limestone. It was covered by a thick layer of ancient dust and dried plant matter that insulated the cold from below. And the wall she built trapped the cow's body heat inside the enclosure, creating a pocket of warmth that the rock ceiling slowly radiated back downward. She did not know the word for thermal mass, but she understood its mechanics with an instinct sharper than most men's education. December arrived with a stillness that felt almost rehearsed. For 3 straight weeks, the sky stayed pale and windless, and the sun climbed low across the southern horizon, pouring weak light onto the cliff face from dawn until dusk. Each afternoon, Mary would stand outside the wall and watch the rock soak up the heat, knowing that every hour of sun was currency she was storing against the coming storm. Briar's belly grew heavier. Mary could feel the calf shifting inside when she pressed her hand against the taut hide, and she began marking days on the wall with a piece of charcoal. If the pregnancy ran to normal term, the calf would come sometime in late February, right when the worst blizzard of the season traditionally hit. But Mary had noticed something the trapper had not known either. Briar was carrying wider than any cow her husband had ever bred. She suspected twins, and that suspicion became her secret advantage and her secret terror. Twins meant double the chance of losing them both. On the 15th of January, a stranger appeared on the ridge above the overhang. Mary saw him first as a dark shape against the white sky, standing motionless beside a horse that looked as gaunt as its rider. She pulled Belle inside and waited, her hand resting on the worn handle of the only knife she owned. The man did not descend. He watched the smoke rising through the cliff crack for what felt like half an hour, then mounted and rode west toward the Harker property. Mary knew what that meant. Caleb had sent someone to check whether she had died yet, and now the man would return with news that she was not only alive but building something permanent. She understood, with a cold certainty that settled deeper than the January frost, that her survival would be seen as a challenge, and challenges to men like Caleb Harker did not go unanswered. 3 weeks later, on a night so cold the stars looked like splinters of glass, Briar went into labor. Mary woke to the sound of the cow groaning low in the darkness, a sound she had heard only twice before but remembered with perfect clarity. She lit the lantern with shaking hands and found Briar lying on her side near the back wall, her sides heaving and her eyes wide with pain. Belle whimpered in the corner. The temperature outside had dropped well below zero, and even inside the shelter, frost formed on Mary's breath as she knelt beside the cow and prepared to do what she had only ever watched her husband do once. The first calf came hind feet first, a breach, and Mary had to work fast. She pulled with the contractions, her arms shaking, until the calf slid onto the packed earth in a steaming rush of fluid and membrane. It was a bull calf, small but breathing. Before she could even clear its mouth, she saw the second set of feet emerging and her heart slammed against her ribs. Twins. A heifer calf followed minutes later, smaller than the bull but alive and squirming. Mary cleaned them both with strips torn from her own spare skirt, while Briar struggled to her feet and began licking them with desperate energy. By dawn, both calves were nursing, and Mary sat against the warm stone wall staring at the two impossibly alive creatures that had just doubled her herd. But the elation did not last. That same morning, the sky turned a bruised purple-black over the northern plain, and the wind began to scream through the rock gaps with a voice that sounded almost human. The first true blizzard of the winter was bearing down on the escarpment, and Mary's food supply consisted of a half sack of cornmeal and 2 strips of dried venison. She had no ammunition for the rifle her husband had been buried with. She had no medical supplies if her own body failed. And outside the overhang, 30 miles from any settlement, the wolves that hunted the broken country had caught the scent of fresh blood on the wind. As the first heavy snow began to fall in a blinding white wall, Mary built up the fire and stared at the blanket door with the knife in her hand, knowing that the true test had not even begun. Somewhere west of the ridge, Caleb Harker had received the report of her survival, and a man who had already stolen a widow's land would not hesitate to ensure that the problem of her existence was permanently solved. The blizzard hit the escarpment like a fist. One moment the air was still and heavy. The next it was a white roar that erased every landmark Mary had used to navigate the broken ground below. Snow drove sideways so thick she could not see the pine scrub 15 feet from the doorway. The blanket over the entrance stiffened into a frozen sheet within an hour, and behind it the wind screamed through the gaps in the stone wall with a sound like wounded horses. Mary fed the fire with dry brush she had hoarded for weeks, then sat with her back against Briar's warm flank. One calf sprawled across her lap, the other tucked beneath her arm inside her shawl. The cow's body heat radiated through the small enclosure like a living furnace, and the limestone around them gave it back in slow waves. Outside, the temperature plunged past 30 below and kept falling. For 2 days and 2 nights, the world outside that cliff face ceased to exist. Mary rationed the cornmeal into thin gruel cooked over the fire in a single iron pot. She fed Briar from the pile of dried grass she had cut and stored along the back wall, and she watched the cow's body closely for signs that her milk might fail. Briar was thin but not starved. The calves nursed nearly constantly, and each time they finished, Mary checked their mouths for cold. A calf with a cold tongue meant hypothermia and death. But the bull calf and the heifer both stayed warm, their small bodies curled into the nest of grass Mary had built against the inner stone. The stone itself became her obsession. She pressed her palm to it throughout the day, feeling the heat that seeped from the rock face like a slow exhale. Even in the deepest freeze of the second night, when frost formed on the ceiling above the fire, the inner wall stayed warm to the touch. Some ancient property of that limestone absorbed the afternoon sun and gave it back over 12 hours of darkness, a geological battery that no farmer in the valley below had ever thought to use. On the third morning, the wind died to a low moan, and the white wall beyond the blanket thinned enough for Mary to push through the frozen crust and look outside. The world had been remade. Snow had drifted to the very lip of the overhang, and the path she had cut down to the hollow had vanished under a sculpted ridge of hard-packed white that glittered in the weak morning light. The escarpment rose above her like a frozen cathedral, its pale limestone streaked with ice. In that sudden quiet she heard it. A low chorus of yipping barks echoed from the ravine below, too close and too deliberate to be random. The wolves had found the birthing scent and followed it straight to her doorway. Mary pulled the blanket back slowly and rekindled the fire to twice its normal height. Belle stood rigid in the entrance, growling with a steady low vibration that Mary had never heard from the dog before. She had no gun. She had a knife, a heavy digging bar she had used to pry stones from the frozen ground, and the absolute knowledge that if the pack decided to push through the narrow entrance, she could not fight them all off. She spent the rest of that morning reinforcing the doorway with every loose rock she could drag, her frozen hands bleeding into the cracks between stones, while the wolves circled somewhere out in the drifting white and waited for the wind to give them an opening. On the fourth day, the pack made its move. Just after midnight, when moonless darkness pressed against the overhang like black water, Belle erupted into a frenzy of barking, and Mary woke to the sound of snarls just outside the stone wall. A wolf had found a gap near the western corner and was clawing through the frozen clay mortar with rapid, desperate scratching. Mary grabbed the digging bar and drove the iron point through the gap with every ounce of strength she possessed. The bar connected with bone and fur, and the snarl became a yelp of shock and pain. The scratching stopped. Then a second wolf lunged at the blanket, tearing it half from its fastenings before Mary could swing again. Belle threw herself into the opening, teeth snapping, and the two animals met in a furious blur of fur and blood and noise. Mary swung the bar a second time, missing the wolf but slamming into the door frame hard enough to send stone chips flying. The wolf disengaged briefly, Belle still snarling, and Mary dragged the dog back inside by her scruff and kicked a larger slab into the gap before either creature could come through again. For the rest of that night, she sat with the iron bar across her knees, Belle bleeding from a gash above one eye, and listened to the pack pace and whine beyond the wall. They did not leave until dawn, but the wolves were only half the threat that winter. The other half came on horseback 3 days later, when the trails had compacted enough for a rider to travel. Mary was outside the shelter, breaking through the thin crust of new snow with a stick to let Briar reach the dead grass beneath, when she saw the dark shape descending from the western ridge. It was not the trapper. This rider moved with an upright, deliberate posture and led a second horse behind him, and Mary recognized both the horse and the man before they were close enough to speak. His name was Emmett Cole, and he worked for Caleb Harker. He had been the one to serve her the eviction paper, reading it aloud while Caleb stood silent on the porch of her own house. Now he rode down upon her winter refuge with the same flat official expression, and the second horse he led was a black gelding that had once belonged to Mary's husband. Caleb had sent him to collect what he believed was still his, the pregnant heifer that had been the sole condition of Mary's exile. Emmett Cole reined in 20 feet from the wall, his eyes moving over the overhang, the smoke, the calves standing shakily in the sunshine behind Mary's legs. For a long moment he simply stared. He had expected to find a frozen corpse. Instead he had found a working homestead carved into a cliff face and a woman whose herd had tripled since the day she was driven away. He cleared his throat. "Caleb wants the heifer back," he said. "Condition of the agreement." Mary stepped forward until she stood between the man and the animals. "There is no agreement," she said. "There was a paper I couldn't read and a judge I never saw. That cow birthed those calves on my land, and that land is this cliff, and I'm not leaving it." Emmett looked at the stone wall, at the smoke, at the cow and the two small calves. Then he said what she had feared since the moment she first saw him on the ridge. "He'll send men out here, Mary, not just me. You know what happens to squatters on Harker land." He paused. "You could walk back now and save yourself the trouble." Mary did not answer. She waited with Belle pressed against her leg and the calves bawling behind her, and after a long, heavy silence, Emmett Cole turned his horse back toward the western ridge without another word. But just before he crested the rise, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "You got maybe 3 weeks before he comes himself," he said. "I'd use them if I were you." That night, alone in the shelter with the animals breathing softly in the darkness, Mary understood that the central equation of her survival had changed. Winter had been an enemy she could study, predict, and outlast. Caleb Harker was an enemy who would not wait for the snow to melt. She had 3 weeks to prepare a defense that could hold against a man with money, hired hands, and the full weight of the law behind him. And the only assets she possessed were stone, heat, and the two rapidly growing calves that now stood sleeping against their mother's side. The weeks that followed reshaped the overhang into something closer to a fortress. Mary worked from the first gray light until darkness forced her inside, hauling larger stones, widening the wall's base to more than 4 feet at its thickest point. She learned which seams in the limestone shed the most heat and arranged the animal's bedding to capture every degree. She discovered that if she placed flat rocks directly in the sun near the entrance and brought them inside after dark, they would radiate warmth through the first half of the night like heated bricks in a winter bed. And she found that the hanging moisture from Briar's breath condensed on the cool ceiling and trickled down into a natural channel in the stone that she could collect in her single iron pot for drinking water, a slow but steady supply that never froze. The cliff was not just shelter. It was a machine built by geological time, and she was the first person to recognize that the machine could be operated. The calves grew with a speed that astonished her. The bull calf she named Frost, and the heifer she named Ember, and both put on weight daily, their coats thickening into dense brown fur that shed the cold like oilskin. Briar's milk held steady, and when the sun was strong enough to warm the enclosure above freezing, Mary would milk a small portion into her cup and drink it warm, the first fresh nourishment she had tasted in months. She began mentally calculating what 2 healthy calves would be worth come spring. Not just enough to survive anymore, enough to buy a legal claim, enough to walk back into that valley not as a beggar but as a buyer. And her mind, sharpened by weeks of isolation and necessity, began to form a plan. On the first day of March, the temperature cracked above freezing for the first time in nearly 40 days, and the snow began to release its hold on the prairie in fits and starts. Meltwater ran in dark rivulets down the escarpment face, and the drift at the entrance shrank enough that Mary could walk fully around the outside of the overhang for the first time since the calves were born. The wolves had gone, driven further north by hunger or the changing season. Belle's wound had scabbed over cleanly. For 4 days the thaw held. Then the cold returned, not with the violence of January but a brittle hard freeze that locked the melt into a crust of ice and preserved the snowpack for another week of grinding wind. The false spring was a trap, and Mary knew it. But she also knew that the real spring was now only weeks away, and she had no intention of waiting for it passively. She built a second wall inside the overhang, a low partition of stacked stones that separated the animal's area from her own, and created a second thermal chamber that kept the calves from wandering too close to the entrance draft. She dug through the accumulated debris on the floor and found a patch of soil deep enough to hold a small fire pit she lined with flat stones. And above it, she constructed a rough drying rack from driftwood she had collected along the base of the cliff during the thaw. The rack would become her dairy. She had no cheesecloth, no rennet, no presses. What she had was a memory of watching her mother make cottage cheese in an Ohio kitchen, and the absolute certainty that milk combined with heat and time would separate into curds and whey, and curds could be pressed, and pressed curds became a food that lasted for months without spoiling. If she could produce enough cheese from Briar's abundant milk, she would have a trade good worth nearly as much as the calves themselves. On the 11th of March, Sila's drover appeared again. The trapper had crossed the ridge on a route he rarely took, and his mule was limping from a stone bruise. He stopped near the entrance with a piece of jerky in his hand and stared at Mary without speaking. The changes to the shelter had transformed it utterly. It was no longer a desperate linta, but an organized, permanent-looking homestead carved into the rock. The wall was higher, the entrance neater, the smoke rising from inside curling gently around the cliff face rather than blasting outward. Most telling of all, Silas saw the 2 calves, now sturdy and playing in the thin sunlight, and his expression shifted from suspicion to something closer to disbelief. "You still alive?" he said. It came out flat and almost offended. "I am," Mary said. Silas chewed on his jerky for a moment. Then he gestured toward the calves. "Twins, born in winter." "That doesn't happen." "It happened," she said. The trapper looked at her then with a new kind of assessment, not pity, not dismissal, but the careful calculation of a man who had spent decades surviving in a world where most people died young. He asked her how she had kept them warm. She told him about the stone, the heat, the way the cliff held the sun long after dark. She did not tell him everything, but she told him enough that by the time he remounted his mule, he was no longer looking at her as a widow who had gotten lucky. He was looking at her as someone who had discovered something. "You should know," he said before he left. "Harker's been asking around the settlement about you. More than asking. He's paying men to ride up here once the snow clears." He paused. "You got maybe 2 weeks." That night Mary sat with her back to the warm stone and the calves sleeping nearby, and she made a decision that had been forming in her mind for days. She would not wait for Caleb Harker to come to her. She would go to him first, but not as a supplicant, as a seller. The most powerful kind of woman in the territory was not the one with a gun or land rights. It was the one with something someone else desperately needed. And Mary had 2 of the best-looking calves in the basin, a dairy that was already beginning to produce, and the knowledge of a cliff shelter that could overwinter an entire herd if the secret of its heat was ever understood. She did not need to fight Caleb Harker. She needed to buy him. And the moment the valley thawed enough to drive cattle through, she would walk down into that settlement and take back everything she had lost. The valley thaw came not gently but in a sudden rush, as though the plains themselves were impatient to shed the weight of winter. On the 20th of March, a warm wind pushed up from the south and turned the last drifts to slush within a single afternoon. By the following morning, the trail down from the escarpment had become a long ribbon of black mud that sucked at the hooves of cattle and the boots of a woman who had not stood on flat ground in 4 months. Mary packed everything she owned into a canvas sack that weighed less than the digging bar she had used to fight off the wolves. She loaded Briar with 2 small panniers woven from willow withes, one carrying the rounds of pressed cheese wrapped in damp cloth, the other holding a sealed jar of buttermilk she had cultured behind the stone partition. Frost and Ember, now nearly 2 months old and steady on their legs, followed their mother with the trusting clumsiness of all young things that had never known a world without warmth in a woman's hands. Mary cast one last look at the overhang that had saved her life. The smoke stain on the ceiling, the low stone walls, the dry bedding, the dark channel where water had dripped into her pot all winter. Then she turned and began walking toward the settlement, her dog Belle at her heel, and the 3 cattle moving behind her in a slow, deliberate line. The road into town ran past the old freight station first, a sagging timber building where the wagon masters usually gathered to exchange news and whiskey. Sela's drover was there, sitting on an upturned barrel with a bandaged mule tied nearby. He saw the small herd approaching before anyone else, and he stood up so fast the barrel tipped over behind him. A woman walking out of the dead hills with a cow and 2 calves was not simply unusual. It was impossible. Every man in that station had counted Mary Tanner among the winter's casualties, a widow who had been too proud to beg and too stubborn to survive. Now she was coming down the mud road with cheese and milk and 2 animals that should not exist, and the expressions on those weathered faces shifted from shock to something that looked almost like awe. Sela's was the first to speak. "Those twins," he said, staring at the calves. "You brought them through." "I did," Mary said. "What did you feed them?" "The cliff," she answered, and kept walking. The settlement proper lay half a mile farther, a loose grid of false front stores and clapboard houses still shuddered against the morning chill. By the time Mary reached the main street, word had already begun to spread. A woman at the well dropped her bucket. A shopkeeper in an apron stepped into the doorway of his dry goods store and forgot to close his mouth. The 2 calves walked with their heads high, their coats shining with health that no winter-born animal had any right to possess. And Mary herself, gaunt but upright, her face wind-burned and her eyes clear, looked nothing like a woman who had spent a season buried in a rock crevice. She looked like a trader arriving with valuable goods. She stopped first at the livestock exchange, a muddy yard behind the livery stable where the weekly cattle auctions took place. The auctioneer, a man named Royce Tolliver with a voice like gravel rolling downhill, was tallying a string of half-starved steers that had barely survived the winter. When he saw Briar and the two calves, he stopped mid-count. He walked around the animals twice, checking their teeth, their hooves, the firm flesh over their ribs. A crowd began to gather. Roy straightened up and looked at Mary with an expression that had no room for flattery. "These calves are February-born," he said quietly. "I'd stake my license on it." "They are," Mary said. "Nothing February-born survives on the open range, not this winter, not without a barn and a stove and a hired hand sleeping beside them." "I didn't have a barn," Mary said. "I had a cliff." Royce said nothing for a moment. Then he named a price for the bull calf that was higher than any animal he had sold that morning. It was not charity. It was recognition that the buyers downriver would pay a premium for cattle with proven cold hardiness, and every man standing in that muddy yard knew it. Mary accepted the offer for Frost without hesitation. She sold the bull calf for enough cash to pay the filing fee on a homestead claim and still have money left over for supplies. Then she took Briar and Ember and walked directly to the land office. The land office was a single room in the county courthouse, its walls lined with survey maps and its desk occupied by a clerk named Jasper Fry, who had signed the eviction paper that forced Mary from her home. He looked up when she entered, and the color drained from his face. He had heard the rumors in the last quarter hour faster than a man could walk across the street. The dead woman was alive, and she had money. "I want to file a claim," Mary said. 160 acres under the Homestead Act. The land includes the limestone escarpment on the northern ridge, the overhang at its base, and the water seep that runs beneath it." Jasper Fry's hand trembled slightly as he pulled out the forms. He had no legal reason to refuse her. She was a citizen, she was unmarried, and she had the cash. While he processed the paperwork, she asked him a question that made the pen stop moving. "Who holds the lien on Caleb Harker's pasture?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Jasper blinked, his mouth working soundlessly. "That's private," he managed. "Is it the bank in Laramie or the investment company out of Cheyenne?" He looked at her then with a new kind of fear, because he understood that she had not simply survived. She had spent a winter doing more than fighting wolves and feeding calves. She had been thinking. She had been remembering every piece of gossip her husband had ever shared about the financial weakness of the man who stole her land, and she had come down from that cliff armed with information as well as cattle. "It's the Cheyenne Company," Jasper said at last. "They called the note last autumn. Harker's been scrambling ever since. The winter hit his remaining herd hard. He lost over half his stock to the drifts." Mary took her filed claim and walked out of the land office without another word. Caleb Harker was in the stockyard when she found him. He was inspecting a pen of scrawny replacement heifers that a rancher from the south had driven up at an inflated price, and he did not see her coming until the crowd parted around her like water around a stone. His face went through a series of expressions in rapid sequence: recognition, disbelief, and then a cold, gathering anger. The woman he had expelled with one pregnant cow was now standing in the center of his world with a healthy heifer calf, a jar of buttermilk, and a crowd of witnesses who had already heard the story. "Get off my property," he said. "It's not your property," Mary said. "Not the stockyard, not the pasture, and not the house you took from me. The Cheyenne Company holds the paper on all of it, and they've called the note. You don't have the money." Caleb's fists clenched. The rancher selling the heifers took a step backward. The crowd held its breath. "I have enough cash," Mary continued, her voice steady, "to buy out your lien, not as a loan, as a purchase. I'll take the pasture, the grazing rights, and the house you threw me out of. You can walk away with nothing, or you can sell to me and keep your dignity. The choice is yours, but the Cheyenne Company won't wait." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that changes the course of a life. Every person watching understood what was happening. A woman who had been given up for dead was buying the land of the man who had tried to destroy her, and she was doing it in public, with the full weight of the law and the market behind her. Caleb Harker looked around at the faces of his neighbors. He saw no sympathy. He saw men who had lost cattle, who had been squeezed by the same harsh winter, who recognized that this woman had found a way to beat the season that had beaten all of them. And then he looked at Mary Tanner, standing calm and unbent beside a heifer calf that should not have lived through February, and he knew he had lost. "Fine," he said, the word barely audible. Mary turned to Jasper Fry, who had followed her from the land office as if pulled by an invisible tether. "Draw up the papers," she said. "I want it recorded today." By sundown, the deal was done. Mary Tanner owned the pasture that had been stolen from her, the house that had been taken, and the grazing rights that stretched to the base of the escarpment where her cliff shelter still held the warmth of the winter sun. And as the news spread through the settlement and beyond, a different kind of realization began to settle over the valley. A woman who had walked into the wilderness with one pregnant cow had walked out with a herd, a claim, and the deed to the land where her enemies had stood. The true secret was not just the cliff. It was the knowledge that a person who had been counted out could, with nothing but stone, sunlight, and stubbornness, rewrite the entire economy of survival on the frontier. The new deed was filed on a Tuesday morning, and by noon the entire settlement had gathered in the muddy street to watch Mary Tanner walk through the front door of the house that had been stolen from her. She did not enter alone. She led Briar through the gate with Ember trotting beside her, and Belle ran ahead into the yard as if she had never left. The kitchen table still sat by the window where Mary had once kneaded dough for a husband who was now 2 years buried. The ashes in the hearth were cold and old, but the walls were sound. Caleb Harker had not lived there during her exile. He had kept the house empty, as though occupying it would confirm what the judge had only said in ink. Now the ink had been reversed, and the woman who slept in a rock crevice for 4 months was standing in her own kitchen, lighting a fire with kindling she had carried down from the escarpment. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. In the weeks that followed, Mary did what no one expected. She did not sell the cliff overhang or abandon it as a bad memory. She returned to it with tools, with a hired mule, and with the first of many wagon loads of stone. She widened the outer wall into a proper windbreak that curved along the base of the cliff face, creating a sheltered yard large enough to hold a dozen cattle. She chiseled a shallow trench along the back of the overhang to improve drainage, and she built a permanent drying rack and a stone dairy where the old one had stood. The natural water seep that had kept her alive through January became the foundation for a small clay-lined cistern. By the time the first autumn frost returned to the basin, the overhang was no longer a desperate shelter. It was a functioning winter station, the first of its kind in that part of the territory, and every rancher within 50 miles had heard of it. Sila's drover came back in early summer, not to trade pelts but to offer his labor. The old trapper had spent the spring thinking about what he had seen in March, and he had concluded that Mary Tanner knew something about winter that he did not. He helped her haul flat slabs of limestone to pave the floor of the shelter, stones that would hold heat even after a week of cloud. He cut and dragged dead pine from the ridge to build wind baffles outside the entrance. In exchange, Mary showed him how she had positioned the inner wall to trap the cow's body heat while still venting the smoke cleanly. Silas studied every detail without taking notes, but he never forgot. By autumn, he was building a smaller version of the same design on a trapping claim 2 valleys east. The knowledge was spreading. The true turning point came in the winter of 1883, 1 year after Mary's exile. It was a hard winter, harder than the one before by some measures. The snows came earlier, the temperatures dropped lower, and the drifts piled higher against every neglected barn and fence line in the basin. But Mary's small herd, now numbering 7 head including Briar, Ember, and the offspring of Frost sold downriver, was bedded safely inside the cliff shelter, their warm bodies filling the overhang with steady heat while the wind howled across the ridgeline above. She lost nothing. Not a calf, not a cow, not a single night's sleep to the sound of wolves. When the thaw came, she walked her cattle down to the valley in better condition than any other herd, and the men who had once pitied her came to her asking for advice. She did not hoard the knowledge. Mary Tanner was not a woman who believed that survival was a secret to be guarded. She believed it was a lesson to be shared, and share it she did. She showed neighboring ranchers how to read a cliff face for the right angle of sun, how to build a dry stone wall that would not collapse under a drift load, how to use a cow's own body as a fuel source inside an enclosed space. She explained thermal mass in simple words, telling them that the rock was a bank that accepted deposits of sunlight all day and paid them back in warmth all night. The men who had once shaken their heads at a woman hauling stones now stood beside her with charcoal and paper, sketching the layout of her shelter for their own claims. The method became known as the Tanner wintering, and by 1885, over 20 homesteads in the region had built similar structures along the limestone escarpments that threaded through that country. The winter death rate among calves dropped by more than half within 3 years, a statistic that the Territorial Livestock Commissioner noted in his annual report, though he never mentioned the woman's name. Caleb Harker did not stay to witness the transformation. After the sale of his land, he drifted west toward Oregon, where reports said he took work as a hired hand on a cattle spread that eventually failed. He never returned to the valley. His name faded from the county records, and the house he had stolen became the Tanner home without contest for the next 30 years. Mary never spoke of him with malice. When asked, she would say only that a man who did not understand stone could never understand survival. It was the closest she ever came to delivering a eulogy. The cliff overhang itself became something of a local landmark. Travelers heading north along the old wagon trace would sometimes divert to see the Widow's Rock, as it came to be called, where a woman had wintered in the stone and walked out with a herd. Some expected to find a crude hovel, a desperate scrape in the earth. What they found instead was a clean, well-ordered shelter that remained cool in summer and warm in winter, its walls thick and true, its layout clearly the product of careful thought. The calves born there continued to fetch premium prices at the stockyard, not because of any special breeding, but because buyers had learned that animals raised in that particular microclimate carried a hardiness that stayed with them through any weather. The Tanner herd became a brand. And then, in the spring of 1902, nearly 20 years after Mary's exile, a party of geologists from the University of Wyoming arrived in the basin to study the limestone formations. They had heard rumors of a cliff that held heat through the winter, and they wanted to understand whether there was a geological explanation beyond simple solar gain. Mary, now a woman of 50 with silver-streaked hair and hands as tough as saddle leather, led them up to the overhang herself. The lead geologist, a young man named Arthur Colby, spent 3 days examining the rock. He took temperature readings at different depths, studied the mineral composition, and finally delivered his conclusion to Mary on the porch of her house. The cliff, he said, contained a thin seam of dolomite that ran diagonally through the limestone. Dolomite, as a rock, has a higher thermal conductivity than pure limestone. It absorbs heat faster during the day and releases it more evenly through the night. The seam acted as a natural heat pipe, pulling warmth from the sun-exposed surface deep into the cliff body and radiating it back into the overhang after dark. Mary Tanner had not known the word dolomite. She had not needed to. Her hands, pressed against the stone on that first afternoon, had felt what the instruments now confirmed. The cliff was not merely shelter. It was a geological anomaly, a random gift of deep time that she had recognized and exploited with an intuition that science could only later explain. Arthur Colby wrote a paper on the formation, which was published in the Journal of Geology in 1903. He called it Anthropogenic Microclimates in Frontier Settlement, a title so dry that Mary laughed aloud when she heard it. But buried in the footnotes of that paper was a single sentence that meant more to her than all the scientific prose. The success of the Tanner wintering method, Colby wrote, was not an invention of European settlers but a rediscovery. Evidence of similar rock shelters used by Plains tribes for winter bison processing exists at several sites within 60 miles of the Tanner claim. Mary had not been the first to understand the secret of the cliff. The people who had lived on that land for thousands of years before her had known it too. She had simply been the one to remember it in a time when everyone else had forgotten. That recognition changed how Mary told the story of her winter exile. In later years, when younger settlers asked her how she had survived with nothing but a cow and a rock wall, she would answer not with pride but with a quiet correction. She had not had nothing, she would say. She had the cliff, and the cliff had been teaching people how to live through winter since before the first wagon ever crossed the Missouri. She had only listened. The frontier, she came to believe, was not a place where cleverness conquered the wild. It was a place where the wild would save you if you were humble enough to learn its language. The grass on Mary Tanner's pasture grew thick and green for 40 more springs. Ember, the heifer calf born in the dark of a February blizzard, lived to the age of 17, producing a line of daughters that spread across 3 counties. Briar died peacefully in the shelter she had helped to warm, a decade after the blizzard that should have killed them all. And Belle, the dog who had growled down a wolf pack in the frozen darkness, was buried beneath a stone cairn beside the overhang entrance, where the morning sun hit first each day. Mary outlived them all. She died in 1931 at the age of 78, in the same house she had won back. The obituary in the county paper called her a pioneer woman of remarkable fortitude, which was the kind of phrase that newspapers used when they did not know the whole story. The people who did know the story understood that fortitude had been the smallest part of it. The largest part had been the ability to see a cliff not as a dead wall of stone, but as a living system, a partner in the work of staying alive. The overhang still stands today, on land now managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The walls Mary built have collapsed in places, but the shape of the shelter remains visible, and the stone floor still holds the faint black stain of her fire. On a clear winter afternoon, if you press your palm against the back wall, you can feel the warmth that she felt, the slow, deep heat that has been radiating from that seam of dolomite for millennia and will continue for millennia more. The cliff is still teaching. The question is whether anyone is still listening. What Mary Tanner understood, and what most of her neighbors never quite grasped, is that the frontier was not a war against nature. It was a conversation. The wind that buried careless barns also carved the overhang that saved her. The cold that killed weak calves also preserved the milk that kept her alive. The stone that looked dead and inert was, in truth, a slow, silent partner in the work of living. And the only difference between her and the men who froze in their own fields was that she had stopped trying to shout over the voice of the land and had finally started to listen. That truth did not belong to her alone. As the geologist Arthur Colby discovered decades later, the Plains tribes had long known the value of south-facing rock shelters for winter survival. The cliff had been a teacher for centuries before Mary Tanner ever pressed her hand to its warm face. She was not the first student, and she will not be the last. But in a time when the frontier myth was built on the idea of dominance and force, her story serves as a quiet counter-narrative. The strongest person in that valley was not the one with the most land or the most cattle or the most hired hands. It was the woman exiled with a single cow, who possessed nothing except the patience to study a wall of stone until it gave up its secrets. We still live in a world that prizes speed over slowness, force over finesse, and noise over silence. But the cliff remains. It is still teaching the same lesson it taught Mary, and the dolomite seam still warms anyone who sits against it. The question that lingers long after the story is not whether Mary Tanner was extraordinary, because she would have been the first to tell you she was not. The question is how many other cliffs, how many other quiet truths are waiting in the margins of our own lives, unnoticed, unappreciated, until a moment of desperation forces us to see them. If this story has reminded you that survival is not always about fighting harder, but about seeing more clearly, then you are exactly the kind of viewer we make these documentaries for. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story of someone who found strength in the most unlikely places. Press the bell, leave a comment telling us what part of Mary's journey struck you the deepest, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that no exile is permanent. Thank you for watching.